The mysterious Mekashya. Tonight's class will begin with us talking about the Chida. The Chida, his name was Chaim Yosef David Azulai, and he was a great rabbi and author of many Sfarim. And he lived in, I think he was born in the 1730s, he passed away in the early 1800s, and he wrote a tremendous amount. Now, one of the unique things about him, he was born in Yerushalayim, and he was sent by the community in Eretz Yisrael. He was sent to raise funds for the community there. And this led to him traveling much of the Jewish world at the time. And thank God, he wrote a memoir of his travels, which is called Sefer Magal Tov. This is the story of his travels. And he writes many interesting things in these Sfarim, in this Sefer, about what he saw, what he observed, and his encounters. So he lived from the 1730s, he passed away in the early 1800s. He's roughly a contemporary of the Maggid Mizrich. Anyway, he writes as follows. He has two lines in the Sefer where he writes about the time that he went to Tunis, in Tunisia, and he writes as follows: Uve'ir Tunis, Koirin HaMikra, they call Tanach, we call it today Tanach, and they call it Mekashya. That's what they call Tanach. So let's talk about this for a second. We call Tanach, which is a Rosh Tevis for Torah, Nevi'im, and Ksuvim. In the Torah, in the Chazal, they didn't use the word Tanach. Chazal used the term Mikra to describe the 24 books. It was also very common in different times in history for Yidden to call it Esrim Va'arba, just like we call Chumash, we call Chamisha Chumshei Torah is a number. Trei Asar is 12 minor prophets is a number. Chamesh Megillos is again a number. So there's a lot of numbers going on in terms of how we classify Tanakh. So likewise, it was very common to call it Esrim Va'arba, 24. And sometimes in Yiddish it was abbreviated into Esrim Va'arba, like it was even said very briefly. And here what he's telling us is that in Tunis, the word that they were using in the late 1700s was Mekashya. Okay. V'sha'altim, so I asked the people there, Ma'u Shem Zeh, what is the meaning of this word? V'lo yadu. However, they did not know. Rak shakach hayu koidim mizman kadmoin. What they said was that this was the name that was used from very early on, but no one knew why they were using the name Mekashya. That is very mysterious, very interesting. You have an entire community of Jews that's using a name for Tanakh. No one knows what it means. This is what the Chida writes in his Magal Tov. The Chida, as I said before, wrote many Sfarim. Another Sefer that he wrote is called Avodas HaKodesh. And here as well, he writes something very similar. First he says, Yizar Kroi Mikra Kol Chavdalet Tanach Choizer Chalila. It is very important for a Jew to continuously learn Tanakh, and when you finish, you should cycle back and learn it again. And then he writes, Va'adayim Ba'arei Amarav, in western provinces, we know he's referring to Tunisia, which relative to Eretz Yisrael is west, Koirin Loi Mekashya. They call Tanakh Mekashya. V'sha'alti, and so here he reveals a little bit of his sense of humor. He says, I asked them, my kasha lahu, what's the difficulty? In other words, Mekashya sounds like the lashon of kashya, difficulty, question. What is the difficulty? What don't you understand? What's the issue over here? The aim poiser, no one knew what the meaning of this word was. Let's fast forward into the 1970s. Rabbi Meir Mazuz, who's still alive today and a very prominent rabbi in Eretz Yisrael, he was born in Tunis, and his father was a great rabbi in Tunis, and he left that country. He left Tunisia in the early 1970s and came to Eretz Yisrael, and he's today a Rosh Yeshiva of Kisei Rachamim and a big leader in Sephardic Jewry. So in a journal that he is published under his auspices that came out in 1976, he writes about this. He says as follows: Uvetunis irma ladati, in Tunis, where I was born, minig ravach likroi letanach Mekashya. The common custom is to call the Tanakh Mekashya. What's the reason for this? So first of all, right away we see that what the Chida observed in the 1700s was still alive and well in the 1950s and the 1960s when Rabbi Mazuz was growing up. What was the explanation? So he says what he heard from the elders. What they explained was, Tanach hu hayasoid v'habasis lekushos v'she'elos. The reason it's called Mekashya is because Tanach is the starting point for questions, investigations, and difficulties. This is a little bit of an interesting perspective. Like, if anything, one could say Tanach is all about giving you the answers. Is Tanach really about the questions? But this is what he says. He says that the explanation given to him was that Tanach is the starting point for all types of investigations and questions, and so therefore it was called Mekashya. Now, he himself does not believe that this is the case, as will become soon, but it does go to show that this is a very interesting phenomenon where you have a good few centuries where Jews are using a name for Tanakh. They don't really understand what's happening. And our question today is, what is the origin of this name, Mekashya, for the Tanakh? That's scene one. Now, scene two is going to take us back, way back, to the year 1299. There is a region today, it's in southern France, it's called Perpignan, but at this period of time, it's really part of Spain, and from a Jewish perspective, when we say Sephardic Jewry, it included this region as well. And a Tanakh is produced during that year, or at least it's completed that year. And here is, today it's housed at the National Library in France, and here is the opening pages of this Tanakh. Very plain sort of Tanakh. Here's the Bereshis Bara Lekim, and we have the first chapters of Bereshis here. You may notice there's some micrography that's around the edges of the page. This is not our topic for tonight, but in a brief a nutshell, what's happening here is there's the concept we spoke about in previous classes of the Messiah, and that is making notes along the biblical text about how many times you have that specific word and that specific spelling, how many other times it appears in Tanakh, and this was written into the Bibles for many centuries. By this point, no one's really using it, but it's like the custom to write it. So because it's not being used, it becomes more of an artistic thing. So they write it, but they write it in an artistic form in this micrography that we're seeing over here. Eventually, as we know, you open our Chumashim today, we don't have the Messiah. These notes aren't there at all, because for the same reason, where these weren't being used. Okay, but this is a regular page of the Tanakh. There is no artwork, the traditional sense of what artwork is in this Tanakh. It opens with Bereshis, it ends with Sefer Divrei Hayamim, and that's the conclusion of Tanakh. But what we have is one page, one spread, right before Bereshis Bara, which is this. One page, right before Bereshis Bara, that has this artwork. And as we can immediately see when we're looking at this, is that these are the vessels, the kelim of the Beis HaMikdash, that is on one spread, a right page and a left page, and around each image, around each set of images, we have psukim. So let's take a closer look at what we are seeing. So the first image that is there is the menorah. The shape of the menorah is not ba'alachzain, they're not diagonal, but they're semi-circular, which is not going to be our topic for today. Under the menorah, you have the tools that the Torah talks about in terms of cleaning out the menorah. Those tools are presented. And below that, you have two sets of 3 steps. Although this is not mentioned in the Torah, there is a Mishnah in Maseches Midos that says that there was 3 steps for the Kohen to stand on when he would light the menorah. For whatever reason, the artist here put 2 sets of the steps. As far as I know, there is no source for the idea of there being 2 sets of steps. The second image that we see is the Shulchan. This is the Shulchan HaTorah. We're actually able to see the words written into the base of the Shulchan, where we had the bread that was baked in the Beis HaMikdash. And on the top, there are 2 bowls, where it says Baziche Levoina, the bowls for spices. And here again, there's a Mishnah, although it's not in the Torah, it says you should put the bread, the spices, the Levoina, on top of the bread. That's what it sounds like. But the Mishnah clarifies that in fact it should be placed in bowls. And here we're presented with those 2 bowls on top of the Shulchan. The next thing we have is the Aron. And here we have in the Aron a set. We're able to see the luchos placed inside the Aron, laying out the 10 Commandments. And on top of that is the kapoiros. And on top of the kapoiros is the kruvim, those 2 winged figures that are facing each other. What's interesting over here in terms of the 10 Commandments, number 1, you'll notice Anochi Hashem Alekecha, the spelling of Hashem's name with the 3 yuds. That's something we spoke about in a previous class, and it's now available for on the podcast for those who want to listen. Go down to the fourth commandment and you'll see something really interesting. What does it say here? I never saw another example of this. It says Zachar and Shamor. We all know that in the 10 Commandments in Parshas Yisro, it says Zachar is Yom HaShabbos L'Kasher. And when you come to Parshas Va'eschanan, and Moshe is repeating the 10 Commandments, it says Shamor is Yom HaShabbos L'Kasher. There are numerous differences between the two, but this is the most famous one. So Chazal already spoke about this and said that really, when Hashem said the Aseret HaDibros, he said Zachar v'Shamor b'dibur echad, it was one speech that came out as saying both words, Zachar and Shamor, and Shmois got the Zachar, and Va'eschanan got the Shamor. Usually when we see art of Luchos, and there's many, going back many, many centuries, we always see Zachar. We never see Shamor. I've never seen both. This is the first sample where I'm seeing both that are written in, which actually raises the question. I know that when God spoke, Chazal told us, you were able to hear both. You heard Zachar and Shamor. Great. But what about when it was written? What was written on the Luchos? Did it say Zachar? Did it say Shamor? Did it say both? So the truth is, and now we'll turn to the handout, is that there's a machlokes about this. If you look at the Ramban, in Shmois, Perek Chaf, Pasuk Ches, he says as follows, V'yitachen shahaya beluchos harishonos uveshniis kasuv Zachar. What's possible is that it actually said Zachar. U'Moshe pirish liyisrael ki shamar nemar imay. And Moshe Rabbeinu came along and said, by the way, orally you should know there's also the concept of Shamor. V'zu kavanas bemes. And this indeed is what Chazal meant. In other words, what does Ramban assume? Ramban assumes that it said Zachar on the Luchos, it did not say Shamor. However, Shachris on Shabbos, we say, every Shabbos, we say the following in the text. We say that Moshe Rabbeinu, Shnei Luchos avanim harid biyadai, he brought down 2 stones, the 2 Luchos, to 2 tablets, v'chasav b'hem Shmiras Shabbos, and it's written in them Shmiras Shabbos. It doesn't say v'chasav b'hem Schiras Shabbos. So this is very interesting. Why does it say v'chasav b'hem Shmiras Shabbos? So there are other Rishonim who disagreed with the Ramban. Look what the Radvaz says. The Radvaz is Reb David ben Zimra. He lives after the Ramban. He's in Egypt, writing in the 16th century, and he says as follows. I disagree that it only said Zachar. Ella, Zachar v'Shamar hayakasu ben. It said both. It said both. And the truth is, he's not the only one. We have an earlier Rishon named the Ra'avan, Rabbi Eliezer ben Nosson, who is medayik in the davening of Shabbos. He wrote, "V'chasab b'hem Shmira Shabbos." We say in our davening, "Chasab b'hem Shmira Shabbos." Why? Because Zachar v'Shamar b'dibur echad nemru, because they were both said. U'shneim hayu beluchos. So both of them were actually written there as well. So what we're seeing here in this little piece of art that was written, created in the south of France in 1299, is that the artist chose to put Zachar and Shamar onto the Luchos. As I said, there may be other examples. It's the only one I saw. This reflects not the Ramban, who, by the way, was very influential in this region. Ramban passed away just 2 decades or so before this was written, and he lived not too far from here, and he was very influential. But we see there are other Rishonim who took a different view, and that seemed to carry the day in this Luchos. Another thing to note is that the Luchos here are square tops, and they're flat tops. Now the reason this is important is because already in this century, we're starting to see in Jewish art rounded tops on the Luchos. And I find it interesting that here they're flat, and I'm going to show you more examples in a moment. But here, notice, it's being created in the Aron. And when the Rebbe spoke about this, he said, the hechrich to say that they had flat tops and not round is because of the way they're situated in the Aron. And everyone knows the Gemara of how they fit in barely, and there's just enough room, and there isn't any extra space. And when you have curved tops, now you're creating extra space. So in other words, it's almost like when the artists were although artists normally when they were making Moshe holding it, they were making rounded tops, but when they were forced to confront the Gemara, when they were forced to put it in situ, into the Aron, so it almost became natural and automatic that they would make flat tops for these luchos. Moving right along, the next thing we get on the right-hand side is the mata. What is this referring to? In Parshas Koirach, it speaks about the fact that they put Aaron's stick into the Mishkan, and miraculously it sprouted and it flowered and almonds came out. And then the mitzvah was that this had to be kept in the Mishkan and the Kodesh and the Beis Hamikdash for all generations to come. So that's on the right. Together with that, the Tzinsenes Haman, and that is a sampling of the man, was also preserved throughout the generations in the Beis Hamikdash as well, and that's portrayed. Then there's another mata. I'm not sure what the other mata is. It could be that the artist wants to put here the mata of Moshe Rabbeinu. However, I'm not familiar with any source that says that Moshe's mata was present in the Beis Hamikdash, so that's something that needs more investigation. We also saw the Mizbeach, and here you see it says Mizbeach HaOila, and then there's a ramp. The ramp looks a little odd, the way it's presented. It almost looks like it was added as an afterthought later on. And below that we have the kiyar. The kiyar is the wash basin that was used for the kohanim to wash their hands. It seems that the water is coming out of animal mouths. I'm not aware of sources that say that this happened in the Beis Hamikdash and the Mishkan, that it had faucets that were animal mouths. But again, this was a very common way in the ancient world that people would make fountains. We also had the Mizbeach Hazav. That is the inner Mizbeach where the Ketores was brought. We have the two Chatzotzos of Kesef and a Shofar, which were used at various times in the Mishkan and the Beis Hamikdash. And then we have a whole set of different pots and pans and sticks that are mentioned in the Torah that were used in the Mishkan and the Beis Hamikdash. And so here is again the page that we are seeing, and on the right hand side it is surrounded by the psukim about making the menorah. In other words, the menorah is the one that's getting all the attention. First of all, if you're going right to left, it's the one the artist put here first. But second of all, the verse that's surrounding the picture is of Hizeh Maisa Menorah, is all about the menorah. So the menorah is take more of the attention compared to all the other ones. We know that today the menorah is a symbol of Judaism, but this seems to have been the case for a long time already. So it's not surprising that this would be the first thing and therefore the most prominent thing. And I'll show you more examples of this soon. But then we come to the left-hand side. The left-hand side is surrounded by what looks like psukim, verses, but this is not a pasuk from Tanach. What it says is as follows. It says, Kol eile all of this, meaning all the vessels in the Beis Hamikdash, this is back in the good old days when we had the temple standing. This line is very similar to a line that we say in Musaf and Yom Kippur after we say the Avodah. It's very, very similar. Then around the image it continues and says, Ashrei mi shara es yikrei tiferes gdulasai v'chol masei takfon ugvarasan. Kudos to the person who actually witnessed all this. And then it goes on to say, Va'ashrei hamechake v'yagia l'roisai. Praise be the person who waits, and therefore will reach the day when he'll see this again. Yehiratzen sheyabana bimheira v'yameinu. That's a paraphrase of the Mishnah and Avos. May it be His will that the Beis Hamikdash should be rebuilt. Yiru einenu v'yismach libenu, that we should see it. Amen, amen, selah. So in other words, we have over here a display of the kelim of the Beis Hamikdash together with a prayer that this should be something that happens again soon. Now we need to ask ourselves. We're not dealing here with a Tanach that's doing art throughout. This is not educational. In other words, there are many things in Tanach that can use maps and pictures and graphs. I'm sure you could illustrate the 6 days of creation. That could be useful. There are many maps when you come to the Jews traveling the desert that could be helpful. You could use images of the 10 Makkos if you want. The list goes on and on. If you're looking for something from Tanach that needs some sort of design, the sky is the limit. And also, what's also odd, and yet what happened here is that we only get this. And not only get this, it doesn't appear next to Parshas Truma. It doesn't appear next to Sefer Malachim when Shlomo built his Beis Hamikdash. Where does this appear? At the opening page, or the first page of this Tanach. Very odd that this is happening here, and we need to ask ourselves a question. Why is this material in the first page of this Chumash, this Tanach that was produced in 1299 in southern France? Now, if this were only one such copy like this, it would mean that we need to ask this question. How much more so that this is not a one-time event, there is more. So now I'm going to show you a Tanach that was produced in a little further south in Catalonia. A little later, this is around the year 1350. It's in the British Library today. And here is, again, the opening page. Right before Bereshis, you get one spread. You notice on the right-hand side the menorah. On the left-hand side, you see some of the other kelim. I'll show you a bigger version of it right now. On the right-hand side, you see the menorah. To the left of that, you see the aron with the luchas inside, with the Aseres HaDibros written in. Not so clear, but I was able to check. It only says Zachar. It does not say Shamar. Under that, under the menorah, you're able to see the steps, but notice here, the artist was a medayik. It is in 3 steps, the way the Mishnah says. It looks like there's 4 steps here. There are some cups that are randomly presented. There's an oil jug, that makes sense for the menorah, and an olive branch, that also makes sense for the menorah because that's how we're getting the olive oil. On the left-hand page, here things get a little messy. On the one hand, you're able to see in the center, well, let's go with the bottom right, you're able to see the shulchan. It looks a little different, but it's the basic concept of the shulchan with the lechem al panim, with the bread that's presented there. On top of that, you see shtei chatzotzros. There's a shofar, but the shofar is not next to the chatzos. That's weird. It's divided by the mizbeach that has a ramp going up, and it also looks like it has steps. In other words, this here is a little sloppier. All the way on the top, you have those two bowls for the levina. Those two bowls are the spices that need to be next to the aron. Here they're all the way on the top of the page. And there are some elements over here that aren't entirely clear what they are. Look at a gross error. There's a second mizbeach, and that second mizbeach has a ramp. Now that's a terrible mistake. The mizbeach hazav, and it says this is the mizbeach hazav. The mizbeach hazav did not have a ramp. It didn't need a ramp, and it didn't have a ramp. So this is another example of sloppiness. If you go all the way to the bottom left corner, you'll see a tree standing on a mountain, which is not entirely clear what that is, but it will become clear in a moment. So yes, it is true that here the artist seems to have been more sloppy, and there are more inaccuracies that are presented on this spread. But our larger question now becomes even more important, and that is, now I have two copies of Tanach. They have no images throughout. They have one thing. One page, one spread of the Kelim of the Beis HaMikdash right before we begin Bereshis. What is going on over here? We have a third sample. This sample is from a little later, from around the year 1401 in Saragossa in Spain. And here, this one spreads out over multiple pages. The first page has just the menorah, and it looks really similar to the menorah that we saw on the previous one. And notice again the verses that are surrounding the menorah. Here again, you have steps. There are three, there are four steps. But let's continue. The left-hand page was left empty, we are assuming that the meaning here is that something was supposed to be drawn, but the artist never got around to doing the work. The next page, here you see on the right-hand side, you're able to make out the shulchan, that wide table, the shulchan. Under it is a whole bunch of cups and bowls, not entirely sure what it is. On the left-hand side, you clearly see the aron with the luchas inside, with the 10 Commandments written out. Here again, it's only Zachar Yom HaShabbos. Under that, you're able to see the mizbeach with, again, it looks like it was first made with steps, and then someone plopped a ramp on top of it. Go to the next page, you go to the next page, you have a blank, and then you have over here a tree that's on top of a little bit of a hill. Now, remember in the other one you had a tree on top of the hill, but here we're told what tree and what hill this is, because we're given a pasuk around this image, and what's the pasuk? The pasuk is from Zechariah. Zechariah talks about the war of Gog u'Magog, the war that will happen before Mashiach's coming, and this is a haftarah that we read on Sukkot, and we're taught over there that God will, so to speak, reveal himself on Har HaZeisim, and the mountain is going to split. This will be a place of refuge that Jews will be able to run away from their dangerous situation, and then ultimately the tide of the battle will turn at that point, and everything will turn positive. This is what the Navi is saying over there. This is the pasuk that is presented over here. So in other words, what happened over here is as follows. Because these artists are putting in the materials needed for the Beis HaMikdash. One of those things is oil. Where did the oil come from? Har HaZeisim, the Mount of Olives. That's where the oil was coming from. So that was one reason to put Har HaZeisim there. But then let's remember, in that earlier one, there was a messianic prayer as well. So Har HaZeisim is also associated with a messianic prayer. What we have here in Zechariah chapter 14. And so the artist puts this here as well. Again, it comes in twice. Once, this is where the oil is coming for the menorah. And number two, we're putting this here, and part of us putting this here has to do with our aspirations and hope that Mashiach is going to come. So let us quote a biblical verse that's associated with the Geula, with Gog u'Magog, that's happening here. I showed you three examples, all from around the same period of time in Spain, that are doing very similar work. And you're even able to see how they seem to be copying each other. They seem to be aware of each other. This is very hard to say that these were all created without being inspired one by the other. The similarities are striking. And guess what? There aren't only three. There are about 20 of these that exist today, all that come from the same region, all from the same period of time, and all with striking parallels with each other. So now this question becomes even more pressing, because if it seems that there was a common custom, this wasn't just something that happened once or twice, there was a common custom to put this, again, no other images throughout the Tanakh, just this, something is going on over here. Now we have what's fascinating is we have one sample and where there seems to have been some cultural fusion, and this spilled over from Sfard into Ashkenaz. In fact, I showed you this in a previous class. We spoke, I think it was Shavuos time, we spoke about a Tanach that's called the Regensburg Tanach. This was produced during this period, the year 1300 in Regensburg, which is very far away, all the way in what's today Germany. And this manuscript is housed today at the Israel Museum. And let's take a look at the image. On the right-hand side, you see the menorah. Here we have some animal elements that are introduced. Then on the left-hand side, it gets really, really messy. And it's not really clear what's going on over here. But what do we notice? We notice here what's different is a person. There's a person dressed like the Kohen Gadol, who is holding some vessel in his right hand, and with his left hand, it seems, which probably is incorrect, is kindling the menorah. That's an added aspect, but just looking at the way the menorah is positioned here, the parallel with the Sephardic manuscripts is so obvious that we have to assume some degree of influence. How much more so when you add in that there's a whole hodgepodge of other kalim of the Beis HaMikdash that seem to be mixed in on the left. First of all, you notice the tree that's standing there. Well, now we know that there was an element of a tree in the previous ones. If you go further to the left, it seems like the artist wasn't sure whether he wants to make the luchais or whether he wants to make the lechem hapanim. And so it looks like a luchais, but it says lechem hapanim, lechem hapanim, lechem hapanim, lechem hapanim. There's some other elements here where it's not entirely clear what those are, but you can make out two chatzaitzers that you could definitely make out in here. And so, yeah, it's not entirely clear if the people producing this knew exactly what they were doing, but something is happening here. Now, before we continue, I want to zoom in on the breastplate, the choshen, that Aaron has over here, because we'll notice something interesting. You notice it says Reuven. Are you able to see that under that is an aleph? Are you able to tell? What's an aleph doing there? Really, each one of the Shvatim, we know that each one of the Shvatim was written on one of the stones, but here there's a second layer of writing under each one. So here is actually the way it appears. Reuven has an aleph under it, Shimon has a beis under it, Levi has 3 letters under it. Okay, so there are sources that talk about this, and this brings us back to our source sheets over here. So let's look at the Gemara in Yuma, Daf Ayin Gimel Amud Beis, talks about the fact that the letters on the choshen would light up, and then it could send you any message, like a coded message could be sent. This is obviously some element of prophecy. So the Gemara asks, but if you count all the Shvatim from Reuven through Binyamin, you're not going to have the letter Tzaddik. Or the Gemara says it, Tzadi. Okay, Chassidim say Tzaddik. So Amar Rav Shmuel bar Yitzchak, Avram v'Yitzchak v'Yaakov ksiv sham. It didn't only have the 12 Shvatim, it also said Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. So the Gemara asks, well, like ksiv tes, still you don't have the letter tes. Amar Rav Achar bar Yaakov, no, Shiftei Yeshurun ksiv sham. It also said the word Shiftei Yeshurun. Yeshurun is one of the names for the Jewish people. Shiftei Yeshurun is the Shvatim of the Jewish people. And in this way, because of the word Shiftei, we get the test so all of a sudden what we're seeing here that there are other letters that are on the choshen. And the truth is, if you look at Rabbeinu Bechaya tells us the breakdown, how it all works, and the rules are as follows. Each stone had to have exactly 6 letters. And if you do the counting of the way it appears on this chart, each one has 6. Reuven is Reish, Ayin, Vav, Vez, Lain, Nun. Add an Aleph is 6. And every single one comes out to 6. And also every single one needed to have writing on 2 layers. And you're able to see, indeed, here, you had Avram on the first line, Yitzchak on the second line, and it spills over on the second line. Then Yaakov, you're able to see. And then you're able to see how it says, Shiftei, the Shin, Shiftei in God, Shiftei, Yeshurun, and Binyamin did not have anything additional, but the Yud and the Langanun are on the next line. Rabbeinu Bechaya lays all of this out. Rabbeinu Bechaya is a contemporary of this artwork. He's in Spain. He's not in Ashkenaz, but he's a contemporary of this artwork. And he also writes that if you count the letters, it equals 72. 72 is a very important name in Kabbalah, Shem Ab. It's one of the ways of spelling Yud, K, Vav, K. If you write Yud, Vav, Dalet, and you write Hey, I don't remember, I think it's Hey, Yud, Hey. If you write it out in full, it equals 72. So this is one important way of formulating Hashem's name. And so this is all addressed by Rabbeinu Bechaya, and the artist knew enough and was advanced enough to decide that he wanted to put this in to this artwork that we have over here. Okay, so let's circle back to, so yes, we did have an opportunity now to do what's appropriate at this time of the year, and that is to look at some of the kalim of the Beis HaMikdash and to deepen our appreciation about them. But our larger question remains, what is going on over here? So now, let me introduce you to the Sefer Maaseh Ephod. Maaseh Ephod is a Sefer that was written in the early 1400s. So it's right during this period of time, early 1400s, in Spain, by a Jew named Yitzchak ben Moshe. Sometimes he's known as Profiat Duran. Profiat Duran. A little bit about his background. He lived through one of the biggest turmoils that Spanish Jewry faced, and that was the year 1391. When people talk about Spanish Jewry, very often there's a big focus on 1492, because everyone knows that in 1492 the Jews were expelled from Spain. But the truth is that already 100 years before the Jews were expelled from Spain, they faced tremendous persecution from Christians at this time. We don't have to get into it ba'arichis now. Suffice it to say that during the year 1391, there were riots that broke out in many Jewish communities across the entire Iberian Peninsula, and many Jews were killed, many Jews were forced to convert and did convert. And this is what began the history of having Jews who nominally converted, but who chose to live on the inside as Jews. They were forced to do that starting from this period of time, and this really begins a whole new tkufa, a whole new period in Spanish Jewry. There are some who say, and I did not have the time to look into this to say yes or no, that this Rabbi Yitzchak ben Moshe was clearly a great scholar and sage, was held by knife point, and he chose to convert in order to save his life, and then he lived for many years as a secret Jew until he was able to run away. If that is true, then this Sefer we know was written in 1404 around. So then it turns out that in 1403, this Sefer was written after this traumatic experience that he went through. Okay, so what is the Sefer Maaseh Ephod? The Sefer Maaseh Ephod is a diktuk Sefer. It's all about the rules for writing and reading and speaking the Hebrew language, which is not an easy field, and he had a very strong koch in this field, and this is the Sefer that he wrote all on that subject. It was in manuscript form for many, many centuries, which you see on the right side is an example of a manuscript from the 1400s, which means it was copied by hand by someone who wanted to study it. On the left-hand side is the first printing of this, which happened in the 1860s. Okay, so let's have a peek at some of the things that he writes in his long introduction. So let's look at number 7, where he says as follows. Omar vo'ei lahem lemikdash ma'at ba'aratzos asher bo sham. There is a verse in Yecheskel that says, that God says, I will be a minor sanctuary to you in the lands of exile that you come to. So this is a very famous pasuk, that although the Beis HaMikdash is being destroyed, there is going to be a secondary, minor type of Beis HaMikdash that's going to exist in Galus. What is the meaning of this verse? Chazal told us that this means the shuls, the Batei Knesiyos and the Batei Midrashes, that this is the Mikdash Ma'at. Or Yisrael by Moshe Alevi feels comfortable adding a second alternative interpretation. Let's see what he says. Just like the Beis HaMikdash was what allowed and enabled God's presence to be among the Jewish people, so this book, what he means is not his book, he means the Bible, Tanach. Tanach is so too God's presence will be with the Jewish people when we read it with the proper intention, and when we analyze its teachings and its sayings. That enables a temple, that enables a sanctuary, that enables a mikdash, because that is the keli that allows God to be with us. So it's similar, he's not making it about the building. Chazal made it about the building of the shul and the Beis Medrash. He's making more about the experience of learning. But he does not say learning Torah in general. He says specifically about Tanach. Then he goes further and says, okay, before we go further, so he laid down here his big idea. And this, he's going to come back to this many, many times over the next few minutes, as we're going to see. What's his big idea? Tanach is the Mikdash. Tanach is the Beis HaMikdash. Then he gives a second reason why Tanach is the Beis HaMikdash. Just like the Beis HaMikdash was a place where Jews received atonement, so by studying the holiest book, this is going to be the way Jewish people receive atonement today, not through the Mikdash, but through the Sefer, through the Chumash. He continues, let's go to text 8, where he says further, this I'll summarize outside. He says, I want to show you another parallel between the Beis HaMikdash and Tanach. The Beis Hamikdash was generally divided into 3 zones. The holiest zone, Kodesh Kadosh. The second zone is the Kodesh, otherwise known as the Heichal. That's where the menorah was and the Mizbeach Hazav. And then you have the outer courtyard, the Azara, and this is the third zone. And these are 3 different levels of sanctity. Well, guess what? When we look at Mikra, what do we find? 3 levels: Torah, Nevi'im, and Ksuvim. Why? Because the 2 are in sync with each other. Torah, that's Moshe Rabbeinu speaking. That's Kodesh HaKadoshim, the highest level of sanctity. Nevi'im, which is the next level. It's not Moshe Rabbeinu, but it's still Nevuah. That's the next level. That corresponds to the Heichal and the Kodesh. We have the menorah and those pieces of furniture. And then you have the outer, the Azara, the outside. He says this corresponds to Ksuvim. Why? What's Ksuvim? Ksuvim, he says, is Ruach HaKodesh. It's a lower level. It's not Nevuah. It's Ruach HaKodesh. Now it's not our time to get into it. It's actually a fascinating discussion of what's the difference between Nevi'im and Ksuvim. Much has been said about it, but he follows the Rambam's model. The Rambam says Nevi'im is Nevuah. Ksuvim means it's Ruach HaKodesh, which is on another level. So this is a third parallel he draws between Tanach and the Beis HaMikdash. Then he says something really interesting. He says, this explains why Sefer Eicha is in Ksuvim, which is a problem. Tisha B'Av's coming, and we're going to read Eicha. So what do we say? Eicha Chazal tell us, that's written by Yirmiyah. Yirmiyah is the level of Nevuah. V'haraya, his Sefer Yirmiyah is where? Is in Nevi'im. Why is the Sefer Eicha in Ksuvim? It's a problem. So he says, the answer is very simple. He says, because our world, he says, there's also 3 different worlds. There's the world of God, the world of the angels, and there's the world, our world. And this also corresponds. Torah is the world of God. Nevi'im, that corresponds to the world of the angels. And Ksuvim, that corresponds to our world. Our world, what's the difference between, the first world is God and the angels. The second is the heavenly bodies in the sky. Physical, but enduring forever. And the third world is our world here. So Nevi'im corresponds to the Shemesh and the Yerech and the Kochavim. Our world, the Ksuvim corresponds to our world. What's the difference between the sun and the stars and the moon and our world? That endures. Things in this world, nothing endures in our world. So where does a book about the Churban that not only has the Churban in it, but is all about the Churban, where does that belong? It belongs in the zone that talks about destruction. Ksuvim corresponds to our world. Our world is the world where things come and go. But Nevi'im, that corresponds to the world of the heavenly bodies, where those things endure forever, and so therefore it doesn't fit so well in there. This is the explanation that he gives. It's addressed by many others. Many others have asked this question. There are other answers that are given, but this is the answer, the interesting answer that he gives. Okay. Another answer that he provides is maybe Yirmiyahu operated on 2 operating systems. There was AM and FM. He operated as a Navi for Sefer Yirmiyah, and he operated with Ruach HaKodesh for Eicha. That's the other answer that he gives, and others give that as well. Let's jump now to text 10. Here we tie everything together. Look at this text written by Rabbi Yitzchak ben Moshe, written in the early 1400s, right during this era when we have all these Tanachs that are being produced with this 1 or 2 pages of Beis HaMikdash art that's presented right before Bereishis Bara. Look what he says. Because of all of these ideas that I've said above, where he equated Tanach and the Beis HaMikdash, therefore, Heitiv Misha Kara Shem HaSefer Hazeh Mikdash Yud-Kei. It is a great idea, the people who call Tanach Mikdash Yud-Kei. Again, we call it today Tanach. Chazal, they call the Mikra. There are many different names. But there are people in his day who are calling it Mikdash Yud-Kei, God's Mikdash, and that makes so much sense. Ki hu be'emes Mikdash Hashem kainenu yadav. This is indeed God's Mikdash. Okay, now he wants to say, why Mikdash Yud-Kei? Yud-Kei is only half of Shem Havaya. Why not Mikdash Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, which we would say, we wouldn't pronounce it today, but at least it should look that way. Mikdash Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, and then whatever term we use, we say Hashem. Fine, so it should be Mikdash Hashem. Hashem standing in for Yud-Kei Vav-Kei. Why do we have Mikdash Yud-Kei? So he says, V'amnan karu Mikdash Yud-Kei, V'loi Mikdash Yud Yud Yud, B'Shem Ben Arba. We know in the Middle Ages they used 3 Yudin to represent Shem Havaya. So why not the full name? L'fishu Mikdash Begalus Hazeh. Because the Bible, Tanach, is only a Beis HaMikdash during Galus. During Galus, Kaviyachol Ein Hashem Shalem Ve'ein Hakisei Shalem. There's this idea that God's name is not complete. The famous place where this is said is till Amalek is wiped out. Okay, when will Amalek be wiped out? Amalek will be wiped out only by the time Mashiach comes. There are other sources that say the reason in Hallel we say Hallelu, Yud K. Why don't we say the whole name? During Galus you can't say the whole name. So he's referring to that idea that because the real Mikdash is a building in Yerushalayim. This is only a substitute Mikdash, Bizman HaGalos, so we didn't call it Mikdash Hashem, which represents the whole name, Mikdash Yudke. Okay, fine. And by the way, Jews in that time didn't have a problem saying, today we're careful, we say Yudke, we don't want to say the two together. I don't think at that time that they had that chumrah. So in other words, they said it Mikdash Ka without the kuf part of that word. Okay. So once we have this information, all of a sudden it becomes understandable. You're making a Tanach. It makes so much sense. On the first page, not a Parshas Tetzaveh, because this is not about educating people about what Parshas Tetzaveh and Parshas Truma look like. No, that's not what these Tanachs are doing. But I want to send a message that this Tanach is really, really important in our eyes. Written in Spain, southern France, in 1299. This is our temple. This is our Mikdash. This is the Beis HaMikdash. So I'm going to make it come alive. I could write it. I could just put the word, but I can make it come alive by putting actually elements of the Beis HaMikdash. And the truth is, some of the manuscripts, it actually says this clearly. None of the ones that I showed you before, but here is another one, the opening page, where the author, the scribe who wrote it, writes his name. It's Yitzchak Bar Yehuda, his father Yehuda Zatzal. And what does it say in that blue panel on the top? Mikdash Yudke. Yes, the hay looks like a ches, but that's very, very common in medieval artistic writing. It's Mikdash Yudke. This is, instead of it saying Tanach on the title page, this is what it says. And then on the left-hand page, we see the menorah, and again, the implement hanging from the menorah, which is so similar to those other images we were seeing before. Again, the two sets of steps, which is something that appears and reappears again and again. I'm noticing now, this menorah looks like there's fire in the background, and that may be invoking, there's a famous medrash about the menorah coming out of Moshe throwing gold into a fire and it miraculously coming out from the flames. That may be something to consider when looking at this image. Here's another example. I only have one page, but it's also his first page before he starts writing the Tanakh. He writes, Ani Elisha Berebe Avram Benevisti. That's a common Sephardic last name. Okay, and he says, Hishlamti zeh sefer shel arba ve'esrim. I finish this Tanakh, hamechune befi ha'hamoin, which everyone calls Mikdash Yud K. There's two Yuds there that I don't fully understand why it's Yud K, but Mikdash Yud K. And he says when he finished it, it's Shnas Chameshes Alafim Umeya. So that gets us to 1340, Va'arbaim 1380, V'shalish 1383. This Tanakh was finished in the year 1383, and he again writes here that it's Hamachune Befi Ha'amoin Mikdash Ka. This is what they were calling it at the time. But let's go back to our good friend, the author of the Maaseh Ephod, Rabbi Yitzchak ben Moshe Halevi, because he goes on to say some shocking things in this introduction that is worthy of our attention. He says as follows. Why am I writing a Sefer on Diktuk? A Sefer on Diktuk in biblical Hebrew is not necessary to learning Gemara. It's not necessary to learning the Mefarshim on the Gemara. It's necessary for one thing. It's necessary for the study of Tanakh. And that's why he was extolling how important it was to learning Tanakh in his introduction for Mikra, in his introduction to this Diktuk work, because the whole Diktuk work is supposed to aid you in learning Tanakh. And so he's pumping up the value of learning Tanakh. Then he goes on to say, unfortunately, Jews haven't been studying Tanakh in the way that we are supposed to be. And he writes that there's three classes of Jews. There are Jews who study Talmud, there are Jews who study Kabbalah, and there are Jews who study philosophy. And he says all these things are great to study. From his perspective, they're all great. But when it comes at the expense of studying Tanakh, he feels that this was a grave mistake that was taken. Now, if you're living in the Middle Ages, it is very normal when you feel someone made a mistake, it's also normal to then say that a tragedy befell them because of the moral mistake that they were making. This is very common during this period. And so he does the same thing. Look what he writes in the first paragraph of text 11. He writes, When we were in Galus, when we used to study Tanach, we survived our exile. However, but then in France and Germany, in these regions, when they got lazy and they didn't study Mikra, they only gave it 1 hour of the week to do the Parsha Shnai Mikra V'Echad Targum. He's saying a shocking thing. No one is learning Tanakh. This is in the era of the Rishonim he's writing. And he's writing, no one in Ashkenaz is learning Tanakh. Maybe the fact that God removed his providence from them and God concealed his face from them, and they were expelled and there were other decrees, and these famous things, maybe it happened because they stopped learning the Tanakh. This is what he says. What is he referring to? He's referring to the first crusade that happened in 1096. That befell the Jews in Germany. The Jews in Sfard weren't touched by that. There are many other things. We spoke about the blood libel in 1171 a few classes ago. That was a famous incident. There were other incidents. And then in France, the Jews were expelled, 1306. And a few times during the 14th century, the Jews were expelled from France. And he knows all this, and he's blaming it on the fact that they're not serving God in the Beis HaMikdash. His Beis HaMikdash is the Tanakh. Then he goes and says, V'ata bizmanenu nispashe zeh achoili b'sfard l'siba sheniskra gankein. And now this illness, what illness? The illness of anti-Semitism has spread into Spain for the same reason. In other words, I told you before, he saw 1391. And he wrote his Sefer a few years after 1391. This was a major change in Spain, where for the first time there was major persecution in Christian Spain. Islamic Spain had other issues, but in Christian Spain, this is the big change. And he says that the change happened because here in Sfard we also started slacking off on our reading of Tanakh. And he goes on to say that just like the temple was destroyed, the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, when Jews weren't serving in it properly, and he quotes a pasuk from Divrei Hayamim, so when we don't serve God properly, through the Tanakh, same thing happens. And then he goes on to say in the next paragraph, Umi Yodeya, who knows? Perhaps Hatzalas Kehilas Aragon, maybe the Kehila of Aragon. Aragon is a region on the Iberian Peninsula, and it seems from what he's writing here and from some other sources that although the riots did reach there, it wasn't as bad at all. The Jews were offered some protection over there. Maybe it's because, look what he says, Leroy Shkidasam alat tefillah, because of their davening, v'lakum belele ashmoiros li'izchanen la'Hashem b'tachanunim yidaberu, when they wake up early every morning or late at night in order to do some sort of special types of davening. And what is all this davening? Yesudasam al mamore akosu v'amizmoirim asher b'sefer tehillos. All of the davening comes from where? Comes from Tehillim. On all this Tikkun Chatzos or whatever early Ashmeidas Habayker liturgy that they were reading, what is it? It's also Tanakh. In other words, for him, Tanakh isn't only studying academically. Even just reciting it with kavana, maybe without kavana, that too is also good enough. And he thinks that maybe I think this is why they were. This is why they were saved. He goes on to say that the Gemara says that the hevel of Tinei Shel Beis Rabban, the breath of the Tinei Shel Beis Rabban, is very, very powerful and has protective properties to it. So normally, how do we explain that? We say, because children don't have sin. And so therefore, it's Torah without any sin. Okay, he offers another interpretation. It's not because of their age, it's because what they're doing. Older people are learning Hakira, philosophy, Kabbalah, Gemara. Children, what are they doing? They're doing Tanakh. And Tanakh, for young and for old, has this tremendous protective powers. This is what he says over there. Now, he goes on, and one last point I want to bring from this Sefer is that he then transitions to teaching people how to learn. It's really interesting. He says, you want to remember what you're learning, right? Here is the 10, 15, I don't remember, tricks for how to remember what you learn. What's the methodology? And then he says as follows. The sixth one is, Haderech Hashishi, look what he writes here. It should be beautiful books. And beautiful parchment. But first of all, it's going to make you want to learn. Second of all, it's going to help with memory. Why? Because when you look at Surais Hanois, when you look at nice images, it encourages you, it inspires you, and it makes you more present, and therefore you're going to remember better. This is actually an interesting source, because we know from some of these classes where we speak about and we show some medieval art that exists in manuscripts, there isn't a lot of writing about the medieval art, but this is one of the sources where you see a consciousness about this project and a full endorsement of it. But then look what he goes on to say. He builds that equation point again. Just like God, remember, Tanach is a Beis HaMikdash. So just like the Beis HaMikdash needs to be with gold and with silver and with precious gems, so Tanach needs to be built with special gems. Especially this book, which again he comes back with what he started with, that it's called Mikdash Yudke. And the truth is that there's already earlier sources that talk about this correlation between Tanach and the Beis HaMikdash. One of the earlier ones is Ibn Ezra. Ibn Ezra wrote many Svarim. He lived earlier, he lived in the 1100s. He wrote many Svarim. One of them is called Moiznei Lashon HaKodesh. It's also about the language. And he writes over there that after Chasimas HaTalmud, there were basically two schools of study. One was the school of study of the Messiah, and that is exactly how we're spelling the words in Tanakh. Is it Malay? Is it Chaser? Is this Parsha Psucha? Is it Stuma? All that work. And he calls those people the guards of the Mikdash. The guards of the Mikdash, and here you see, he's using Mikdash for Tanakh. And then he says the second school are the people who are interested in Diktuk. So there's Messiah, that's again the spelling of the words and the format of the Parshiyos, and then there's the Diktuk. But what the words he uses is he calls Tanakh Hamikdash Hamaois, and he calls this Asher Loi Yochel Zor La'achriva. In other words, no foreigner could destroy it. The destruction could befall the physical Yerushalayim, but the Yerushalayim of the book, that no one could destroy. So we see that Ibn Ezra already earlier is using this language. In terms of tracing exactly when the term Mikdash Ka became the name for Tanakh, it's hard to know exactly when it is, but again, we're already able to see the late 1200s, through the 1300s, through the 1400s, people are using it, people are calling it, people are celebrating it, and this is a prominent name, but then it gets forgotten. And where do the Jews in Tunisia, where do they come from? The Jews in Tunisia are Megurashei Sfard. They came from Spain. But over the centuries, they completely forgot what this original term was, and instead of calling it Mikdash Ka, they were just calling it Mekashya, which is what we opened the class with. And the Mechidah was aware of all this. Well, how was the Chidah living in the 1700s aware of all this? Because this Maisa Ephod was quoted by other people. It was quoted by the Shalaf, for example. It was quoted by many, I shouldn't say many. It was quoted by various farm. And so therefore the idea seeped through the ages, and the Chidah knew everything that was around during his century, and so therefore he knew this. So when, back to Sefer Magal Tov, what he tells them, they tell him that it's called Mekashya. So I asked them, what is the name? They didn't know. And then I laughed and I said, what's the Shverikite here, right? What's the difficulty? And I told you that Rabbi Mazuz said that he was told it's because the Tanakh is the basis for all future kashas, for all future questions. So he says, what I told them is, Rakshakacho Yukoidim is man kadmoin. This is an early name. Umavur, if you look at the bottom, Shehu Mikdash Yudke. That's the name. It's Mikdash Ka. And the name got corrupted by the people. Mikdash Ka turned it to Mekashya, and that's what people were calling it, having no clue what the origins of all of this was. Now, after studying this entire topic, I was left with a question, big question. The question that I have is great. You know, if I want to show that my Tanakh is the Beis HaMikdash, I think the more intuitive thing is to make an image of the Beis HaMikdash. The Azara, the walls, the Heichal, the High Heichal, the building. That's how people usually do it. There is no image of the building. In none of the 20 samples inspired, does any of them use the image of the building. It's only the Kalim. Why the Kalim? This is the question that's bothering me. I don't have a perfect answer. But I'll suggest three things. Number one, perhaps there was an issue as follows. The first Beis HaMikdash and the second Beis HaMikdash had two very different looks. And the Mishkan had its own look. In fact, there was more than one Mishkan, so each Mishkan looked a little different in terms of the overall structure of the Mishkan. Then, remember, there's also the future. There's the third Beis HaMikdash, which we saw in the manuscripts they're writing for and hoping for. What's the third Beis HaMikdash going to look for? The Rambam in Hilchos Beis HaBchira says that we don't know. There are some parts that we know. There are some parts of Sefer Yecheskel that we don't understand what it means. And so we don't really know. So perhaps the idea of creating an image of the building, then you get into questions. Which building? And if you lock yourself into one, then it's not the third one, so maybe they didn't want to go there. So they said, let's do something more predictable. The Kalim, more or less, there were some differences, but more or less the Kalim were said to be the same and will be the same. And so therefore, you have more continuity with the Kalim, so maybe this is a reason why they chose to do it with the Kalim. That's idea number one. Idea number two is there's a long tradition of deriving very extensive and deep lessons from the Kalim of the Beis HaMikdash. Till today, Mechabrim are doing this. Definitely Hasidus does this, but even before, Kabbalah did this. But if you go way back, all the way to Targum Yonasan ben Uziel on Parshas Pekudei, when he's talking about the Kalim of the Beis HaMikdash, he already then was talking about the symbolic meaning of each one. The Shulchan, well, that's where the food is, so that represents sustenance, that represents Parnasa. The Lechem Apanim, well, it was 12, so that corresponds to the 12 Shvatim. The Menorah, light, so that corresponds to wisdom, to tzaddikim, the heavenly bodies. Mizbeach Hazav, the inner Mizbeach, that represents Esek HaTorah. Mizbeach HaOila, the outer Mizbeach, where they brought the animal karbanis, so that represents Hachnasas Orchim. Right, the concept of a person's table is compared to this Mizbeach is because of the Hachnasas Orchim, inviting guests. Kiyar, washing, that's tshuva, transformation through water. Shemen HaMishcha, the oil, that represents Malchus Yoda HaMashiach, because remember, the king has to be anointed with oil, which is another dimension. It's a third dimension. Till now I mentioned that oil is needed for the menorah, and oil is the Nevuah and Zechariah about the mountain splitting, but now we're seeing there's actually another element of oil. Oil itself is indicative of Malchus Yoda HaMashiach. All of this you had in Targum Yonasan. So if you just put out an image of the Beis HaMikdash, great, you have an image of the Beis HaMikdash. I'm not aware of as much depth and meaning that's imbued into all these details. So maybe this was richer for people. Obviously, the Jews in the Middle Ages were familiar with Yonasan ben Uziel and with many others who followed and emulated this path and did this type of work. So maybe this was a better way, a more inspiring way of conveying their mikdash. The third and final suggestion, which I don't believe was on anyone's mind then, but I do think is interesting, is a Sikha of the Rebbe about the Rambam and the Ramban when it comes to the mitzvah, the building of the Beis HaMikdash. Why is that? The Rambam famously, I'll just summarize it outside. The Rambam, this is a Sikha in Chelek Yud Aleph. The Rambam famously says that the mitzvah of building the Beis HaMikdash is there should be a bias, muchan, for akravas karbanis, prepared for karbanis. So already the Ramban said, I have a different perspective. It isn't that there should be a Beis HaMikdash prepared for karbanis. It's there should be a Beis HaMikdash, so God should dwell in it. Yeah, you also do avodah in there, but don't make the whole Beis HaMikdash about the avodah. But Rambam does that. Rambam says the reason and the purpose of the mikdash is for the karbanis. And the Rebbe clarifies that karbanis doesn't mean just karbanis. Karbanis means all the avodas of the Beis HaMikdash. Karbanis happens to be the flagship avodah in the Beis HaMikdash, but really what the Rambam means is that the mitzvah of binyan HaMikdash is for the avodah that's going to happen in the mikdash. Therefore, is there a mitzvah to build a menorah? Is it count of one of the 613? No. Is there a mitzvah to build a shulchan? Does it count as an individual mitzvah of the 613? No. But doesn't it say in the Torah, you should build a shulchan, you should build a mizbeach hazav? Why are these not individual mitzvahs? So the Rambam's answer is, because all of that is the mitzvah of Beis HaMikdash. There's one mitzvah, build a Beis HaMikdash. Beis HaMikdash on its own is nothing. Beis HaMikdash is to enable all of these things. So you're not going to make a mitzvah out of each one of these things. It's all part of the mitzvah of building the Beis HaMikdash. The Ramban, however, the Ramban looks at it differently. The Ramban comes to the table saying that there's, before any engagements, before any verbs happen in the Beis HaMikdash, you have the very fact that it exists. And the Beis HaMikdash existing is a place where you have Asheras Hashchina, God's able to dwell in that. Then on top of that, we end up doing we start doing the individual avodas, and therefore, it's a question. Why is the making of, according to the Ramban, the Shulchan should be its own mitzvah? Because it's not, one thing is binyan beis hamikdash, another thing is to make the Shulchan. Okay, so Ramban comes up with a reason. It's not negev. Okay, the reason is because there is a mitzvah of making the lechem upon him, and the mitzvah of building the Shulchan is part of the mitzvah of lechem upon him. Okay, that's Ramban's way of dealing with it. But the bottom line is, what do you see from here? In the language of the Sikha, the Rebbe is using this language. According to the Ramban, there is no value in the Beis HaMikdash alone. The Beis HaMikdash on its own is nothing. The flowering, the fruition, the goal, the object of the Beis HaMikdash is the Kalim which enable the Avodah. That's what turns the Beis HaMikdash into something. So, while I don't think this was anyone's mind, but I think looking now, we're able to look back and say, the fact that they use these images, it stims a little better according to the Rambam than it does according to the Ramban. We want to draw the temple, we want to drag the Beis HaMikdash. What's the Beis HaMikdash? Beis HaMikdash is a Kalim, that's all it is. It's the whole thing of Mikdash is Muchan for Karbanis, is Muchan for all the Inyanim of the Avodah. See, there are three suggestions. Again, one was, it's complicated, making a Beis HaMikdash is easier, simpler, and there's more continuity in making the Kalim. Number two is the symbolic meaning. And number three is this idea that the entire Mikdash is only there for the Kalim. These are three possible explanations for this, but I'm obviously interested in if anyone has additional explanations. Ad kan.